right, excuse me. Let's get started. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off, talking about competition. So competition occurs between species when, and this could be inter-specific competition between two different species, or intra-specific competition between two of the same species, but we're going to kind of think about inter-specific competition here. So competition will occur when resources are limited. So a resource is any component of the environment, for example, food, water, light, space, that an organism requires. And I'll tell you that resources are always limited. So everybody's always a little hungry, is what I like to say. You know, everybody's kind of looking, you know, needing more food, needing more water. And so it's inevitable that organisms will compete. You know, so you have a couple examples here of these birds competing with this mammal for food, or these two organisms competing for water. Or it could be something like, in this image, we see a number of different plant species all competing for sunlight. You know, and some are overtopping the others, trying to get to the sunlight. And also, although you can't see it, there's below ground competition here, where the plants are competing for both nutrients and water. So there's lots and lots of competition going on all the time. So I want to talk about a term we call the niche. So an organism's combined resources make up its niche. So let me write this down. What we call an organism's ecological niche is the set of physical and biological conditions that are needed for the species to grow, reproduce, and survive. Needed for, sorry about that, for growth, reproduction, survival. So basically everything the organism needs to sort of make its way in the world. So one of the things that researchers have found when they go out and they, look at, hey, what is the niche of this organism? What are the set of physical and biological conditions it needs to survive? So this is basically the sum total of its resources, the habitat it needs, the food it needs, the light it needs, all that stuff taken together is what describes the niche. So here's the thing, multiple species often occupy similar niches, meaning they need the same set of similar resources. They want to be in the same sort of environment, using the same food resources, and in other words, what we can say is their niches overlap with each other. And this can cause a bit of a problem. And it can, of course, lead to competition. And what we've seen over time is that when we have organisms in the same environment that occupy similar niches, we sometimes see one or both of the organisms sort of shifting their niche a little bit. So this results in what we call the fundamental versus the realized niche. So fundamental versus realized niche. So a fundamental niche, so the fundamental is the range of all resources that organism is capable of using. But what happens is if two species have the same or similar niche, they're going to compete. And one of two things happens. Either what we would call competitive exclusion happens, where one species completely overruns the inferior species and leads it to be extinct, at least from that area. Or they can have what we call competitive coexistence, where two species manage to coexist with each other despite sharing limited resources. And if that second thing happens, what we call competitive coexistence, what's going to happen is they're going to sort of divide up the niche space, and each species is going to use different parts of the fundamental niche. And what they'll actually end up using, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, is what we call the realized niche. That's supposed to be a Z. The realized niche. So the realized niche is the range of resources that a species actually uses when it's sharing with other species. So this image here is kind of the classic example of an experiment that looked at fundamental versus realized niches. So what we have here are two species of barnacles. So one of the species of barnacles has a sensitivity to desiccation. And so it basically doesn't like to be in, sort of a area where it would be more prone to desiccation. So it doesn't go into this very sort of top area. It likes to be kind of a little bit lower. And there's this other type of barnacle that actually could be kind of in a much larger niche, right? It can deal with desiccation okay. But what we see happening is a division of the niche space. So this one, thalamus, which is pretty good at pretty much taking up the entire coastal zone here, is excluded. Its fundamental niche might be the whole thing, but it actually ends up only being in kind of the upper zone because it gets excluded by competition through of the other organism. So basically this semi-abalinus one competes with the thalamus one and doesn't allow it to exist in this lower intertidal zone. So the realized niche of this thalamus species is that it kind of has to end up living kind of in the upper zone because it gets outcompeted in this lower zone. So that's an example of realized versus fundamental niches in nature, and this happens a lot. So what this division of niches leads us to is something called resource partitioning. So this is the most common mechanism of coexistence. So, and it's related to this idea of your realized niche. So resource partitioning is exactly what it sounds like it is. You are partitioning up the resources. They're sharing a limited resource by using them in different ways. And this allows species to coexist. So let's look at this example here. So there's about 7 species of lizards known as the anolis lizards that all require all occupy kind of a similar niche. They all eat small insects, and they all require sunlight to warm themselves. And what they've seen is when they look at habitat where we find these species, we see that they have sort of partitioned the resources so that some species are hanging out in kind of the lower understory branches to sun themselves and to hunt for food. We find some species in the mid-story area, so kind of like middle-sized trees and things hanging out on those branches and surfaces. And then we find some up in the canopy, hunting and using those. So they've partitioned the environment vertically in terms of where to perch and get their sun and where to hunt. But the cool thing that they found is that when all the species were together, they rarely strayed from their environment. So the lower understory perchers stayed there, hunted there. They didn't go in the upper canopy, and vice versa. But when they did removal experiments, they found, so if this species that lived down here in the understory, if they've removed all the other lizards, then this species expanded its habitat and would go everywhere. So we see that, actually its fundamental niche is potentially, all of the vertical space, but it is living in its realized niche due to competition. And so this is a form of niche partitioning leading to resource partitioning so that we can coexist with each other. One very cool thing we also see is that coexistence and dividing up the resources in order to coexist can lead to what we call character displacement. So character displacement is an evolutionary phenomenon in which species that compete for the same resource will actually diverge in morphology and behavior. And again, this is to partition up the resources. So this, I really like this example. So these are looking at some of the finch species that lived on the different Galapagos Islands. And what we're looking at here in this graph, so let's orient ourselves for a minute. So we have different islands, okay? And what we're looking at here is the depth of the beak. So when we had this species here living by itself, this graph represents the average beak depth. How, in other words, how deep was the beak. And here's another species living, again, when it's living by itself, and you can see there's a lot of overlap here, right? Their beak depth is pretty similar. They're falling about in the same place on the graph. Now, there are a couple islands where these species live together. Okay, so they're competing for the same resource of seeds. And here we see character displacement. We see the one of the species has shifted, that average beak depth gets smaller, and the other species has shifted, so average beak depth gets larger. And the reason this is happening is because they are partitioning up the resources, with one species that is evolving the smaller beak eating smaller, softer seeds, and the species that is evolving the larger beak eating larger, harder to crack seeds. So that's an example of character displacement. They're starting to diverge in the morphology of their beaks in order to subdivide the habitat so that they can coexist. So finally, let's talk a little bit about that final class of interactions. So let's talk about mutualisms. Mutualisms, I think, are pretty cool. So mutualisms are a plus-plus interaction. Both species benefit. And there's a number of different examples of mutualisms. There is the mutualism, a really sort of well-known one is plants and fungi. So plants and what we call mycorrhizal fungi. So that's a picture of it here. So see all these threads here? What looks like super fine thread-like roots, those are not roots. Those are the hyphae of fungi. And what happens is these fungi form an association with plant roots, and they help the plant by pulling up more water and nutrients than the plant would be able to by itself. And the fungi benefits because the plant provides it with carbohydrate from photosynthesis, so they benefit each other in this way. Another classic example are plants and the flowers they, are insects or other animals and the flowers they pollinate. This insect is getting food reward in the form of nectar or pollen from the flower, and the flower is benefiting because this insect is spreading around its pollen, which are the male gametes, allowing it to reproduce. Other examples would include things like frugivores, which are fruit eaters, right, that will eat fruits with seeds in them, and the animal benefits because they're getting food, and the plant benefits because that animal is spreading its seed around. And we also find specializations evolving because of these mutualisms. So for example, in the mutualism between the plant and the pollinator, we see plants evolving more and more attractive flowers, more and more rewards, like maybe more nectar or more sugary nectar to attract that pollinator. And we also see morphological changes. For example, the plant might evolve to place its sexual structures in such a way that it's most likely to make contact with the pollinator's body. The pollinator in turn is going to evolve to be able to more efficiently extract resources. For example, maybe develop a longer tongue so it can more efficiently get nectar from the bottom of a flower. Commensalism is sort of an interesting one, and it's kind of the one in nature that's kind of the hardest to sort of prove. Right, so this is where it's a plus 0, right? One species benefits and one species isn't harmed. So what you're looking at here are barnacles on the fin of a whale, and the barnacles benefit, right? They have a place to live, they get a free ride along with the whale, and the whale is not harmed to our knowledge. Now, you maybe could make an argument, well, maybe it's less aerodynamic for the whale, or water dynamic for the whale with these barnacles on there. But as far as we can measure, it doesn't hurt the whale in any way, so we would classify that as commensalism. And finally, amensalism is again where one is harmed and one is unaffected. So a good example would be elephants walking through the understory and crushing trees and pulling up, kicking up plants and killing them. The elephant's not trying to do it. It doesn't affect the elephant in any way that we can measure. Obviously, the plants are harmed, so that would be an example of an amensalism that happens between species. All right, that's the end of chapter 55. If you have any questions, please shoot me a message and we'll talk about it. All right, have a good one.